everyone, and good afternoon. Indeed, as Jim Close just said, this conversation continues what we've been hearing before from Madeleine Albright and David McAllister. We're going to be talking, what else, about the future of democracy and government in these very challenging and hazardous times. I'm Shada Islam. I'm an EU commentator and watcher based here in Brussels, and I'm also heading my own company now called New Horizons Project. I'm delighted to be back at ESPAS again this year and talking about this very crucial issue of democracy and government with four brilliant panelists, all of them very well known, so I'm not going to spend time explaining all the different achievements in length. We have Brigid Laffan, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Brigid, hello.
Good afternoon.
Stephan Lewandowsky, Chair in Cognitive Psychology, University of Bristol, co-author of the recent Joint Research Council report on technology and democracy. Welcome as well. Mathew Burrows, Director, Foresight, Strategy and Risks Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And last but not least, Antonella Mei-Pochtler, Special Advisor to the Austrian Chancellor and Head of Think Austria. So we're going to kick off with the panel, talk to each other for some time. I have some questions for you. But first of all, I'd like our technical friends to put up the Slido opinion poll that we'd agreed on. And so all of you watching online, you know how to do this by now. Hashtag ESPAS. And there is a opinion poll coming up, which talks about, the different innovative ways that we can help and reinforce our democracy. So please, are we having that come up now? And also, you will be allowed, and I hope you will be doing so, using the chat function to ask questions of our panelists. And you can do so by sending them to the presenter. And then if I have time, and I hope I will ask you the questions. So let me kick off the panel discussion. Do we have the Slido poll going up there? So you can all respond, and then we'll see it before we go to the conversation. There we are. So what innovation would help rebuild trust and democracy? Panelists, I'd like you to look at it as well. So the first option is universal basic income, strong measures to limit public debt, greater tax equity, participatory democracy, more decision-making at regional and local level, and finally, laws against misinformation on social media. So please go ahead and respond. And once you've done that, I'm going to present it to the panelists and get their opinions on your opinion, if you like. So let me kick off with you, Brigid. We've talked about, Madeleine Albright was talking about democracy in trouble, pushbacks, but also democracy being quite resilient. And within Europe today, we face quite a few democratic challenges. Now, you only have 3 minutes each. I have to be very strict about this. But in 3 minutes, Brigid, your opinion on what are the main challenges we face?
So let me begin with some good news, because I think good news matters. Across Europe, all 27 member states, but also would have included the UK, the European Value Survey tells us that Europeans, the majority of Europeans, share the same concept of democracy and what it consists of. And this is a very good thing, that democracy is not divisive. People, the majority of people know what it represents and support it. However, there is a difference on performance. In other words, in the northwestern part of Europe, more citizens feel that democracy works for them than in the eastern half of the continent or the southern half of the continent. And the issue tends to be around the social state and the protective state, i.e. welfare. So performance. Secondly, I think we have a cancer in the EU at the moment when it comes to democracy, and that cancer is represented particularly by two countries, Hungary and Poland, whose governments, and I'm not saying peoples, but governments do not share the basic democratic values that are required to be a member state of the EU. And it should worry us greatly that neither of these countries would be admitted to membership today with the governments they now have in terms of the rule of law, freedom of expression, etc., etc. And I think that is the single biggest challenge facing the EU. Secondly, structuring of politics. The old large mass organizations are no longer as powerful as they once were political parties, trade unions. So in other words, there is a crisis of representation. And that crisis of representation manifests itself in the fragmentation of our politics, in the rise of challenger parties, populists, usually of the radical right, but also some on the radical left. And the single biggest predictor of political behavior today in Europe is education. So that also links to issues of a societal divide between those who've had more opportunities and those who've had fewer. And then the third area I would draw attention to is Europe always faces the challenge of how we ensure that, given the competences of the EU and its centrality to public policy, how can we render that space as democratic as it can be? It's always going to be much thinner than national democracy, but it needs to be thick enough to hold Europe together. I leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Brigid. So you started off with the good news, but there was quite a lot of challenging news, if you like. You've talked about inequalities. You've talked about Hungary and Poland, of course, which is very high up on everyone's agenda. You've talked about populism, values, and the crisis of representation. So quite a lot to handle, but of course, resilience is very important, and we're moving on. So Stephan, I just wanted to ask you also, and it's interesting, Brigid didn't mention it yet, but we're also in a high-tech world, digitized world, and we're seeing this now, meeting across oceans, if you like, in a way. So the governance of innovation and digitization, I mean, can we in Europe be rule makers in this? Because so far, really, we're just rule takers, aren't we?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that was basically the first point I was going to make, that a lot of people are thinking that the internet at the moment is a free-for-all, ungoverned space. But it actually isn't. And I think we have to start out by realizing that the internet is tightly governed by algorithms, by social media platforms that are designed to enhance user attention and time spent on the platform. Now, these algorithms are designed without democratic accountability at all. They are determining the information diet of millions of people around the world, and they are known to have adverse consequences. For example, we now know that Facebook was aware of the polarizing nature of the algorithms, but chose not to do anything about it because they were worried about losing revenue. So we have to start by realizing that we are in a regulated environment, but the regulations are not made by democratic institutions. So for the European Commission, the European Union, to reclaim some regulatory space is not actually introducing regulation. What it is to take it from corporations to democratically accountable bodies. Now, of course, even with democratic accountable bodies, the last thing we want to do is to introduce censorship or control over content. But it turns out we don't have to do that, I don't think, except in extreme cases of hate speech and so on. And the reason we don't have to do it is because we know enough about how human beings think and how they consume information that we can redesign the information architecture online in ways that facilitates the emergence of high quality information rather than, at the moment, information that is just capturing our attention so somebody else can make money from that. So, and that is what the report you mentioned was basically about, is to map out a regulatory space where that can happen.
Important to have a regulatory space, and there, of course, the role of democratic accountable bodies. So we'll look further into that as we move on. But thank you very much, Stephen. So Mathew, a lot of discussion just before our conversation now between Madeleine Albright and the EU about transatlantic relations. Of course, the victory of Joe Biden is being hailed, and everyone's very happy here. So do you think that this transatlantic alliance, US and Europe working together, can overcome some of the challenges of democracy that we're facing today and that we've seen over the last 4 years in the United States? Mathew Burrows.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I think it's fine, as Madeleine Albright likes to say, that we should get together and profess our values, democracy, again, and obviously that's democracy is a founding principle for the transatlantic relationship. I am not certain, I'm in fact very certain that that's not going to deal with the economic, social, cultural issues which are really undermining democracy in our countries. And for that, a lot needs to be done, domestically. And I think, these problems have built up over several decades. If you look on the opinion survey data, back in the 1990s, right at the end of the Cold War, Americans were very optimistic about their democracy. They thought it performed very well. And now you're finding that the Americans, and this is on both sides of the aisle, really have major problems and feel very pessimistic. And a huge watershed moment really was in 2008, where you had at least part of the country feeling that it was left behind. And, we should cast ourselves back to that time. I mean, you had the whole issue about the financial centers being bailed out, but not, the main, what in America we call the main streets. So the small towns, rural areas, those that line up behind Trump felt terribly left behind. I think we have it goes beyond economics. I mean, when you look at, it's really a cultural thing now. There's new studies showing, we're segregated politically. More and more areas in the US are uniform in their political views. They don't have diversity within those communities. And then we talk about the technology here. I mean, you can live in your, reality that is totally separate from your neighbors. And I think, you have two Americas. How many in the coastal areas are reading New York Times and watching Fox News? It tends to be they're very siloed. So they have a totally different idea of what is happening. Unfortunately, I think, the things that cure this, like education, Brigid talked about that, about, as we saw in the polling, more income, more equality, dealing with inequality. Those take a long time. And I don't think, we have actually started on those really deep-seated issues. And you have an elite that doesn't oftentimes understand what is going on in the other part of America or in Europe, where rural areas, we saw this with the Gilets jaunes, felt left behind.
Right. So polarization, social divides, inequalities, and segregation, etc. I'm going to come back to that in the second round, but so Brigid can think about it as well and how that sort of applies to the EU. But let me move on to Antonella as well. So we talked about algorithms and their impact on information and people and democracy. What about misinformation? I mean, we talk a lot about fake news, Antonella. How do you see that as a challenge to our democratic systems?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for this interesting question. I think that we need first to discuss what is misinformation versus disinformation. I think that we have actually the disinformation is the intentional misleading information, while misinformation is a broader thing, and has also the unintentional lack of information or wrong information. And I think that what we have seen is that due to the technology, due to social media, we have an increase in simplicity in handling disinformation and the possibility of very exact targeting. And I think that is really at the core of targeted disinformation that is working, unfortunately, working quite well. So the issue is that there is a lot to win to do that. There is high value in doing that. So I think that that's the first thing. On the unintentional part, just the issue that we have nowadays is that we move from from a period where we had partially under-information to a period of over-information, but linked to tribal media versus mass media. So I think that the tribalization of the media space has created, just a lack of even and shared information. I think that is at the core, and therefore, when we think about what can we do to counter it, I think that we have I think that three elements at hand. First of all, education. Secondly, observation about where it's happening, and the third thing is regulation. And I would just say it's really in this order. Education is at the core. The digital literacy and the capability and the media literacy should be part of every school education to make sure that people know where are sort of the origins of intentional, as we say, disinformation, and how people can inform themselves better, and also trying to understand how one can exit their own bubble. So I think education is core. Observation, when I say observation, is quite important, both by private companies and the platform providers, but also by governments, to really observe what is going on. And there, really technology can play a very important role, because we need to understand which are the vulnerable groups. We are talking a lot about health vulnerability, but we need also to understand what is the vulnerability of different groups for misinformation. Vulnerability of countries, you mentioned it in the, I think Brigid mentioned it quite rightly so. We have some countries where which are sort of more, I would say, have more problems, I would say, more challenges. We need to differentiate by media sources, and also by platforms. And let me come therefore to regulation. I think we are always, we have a constant discussion about where is the accountability. And, in a 3-minute statement, I cannot answer that, but I think that we need to discuss, where is the accountability, where is the accountability of the platforms versus accountability of media generators, and how can, what is the right interplay. And let me finish up with the fact that I do not think that we can handle misinformation without having a real strong citizen involvement in defining this space. I think it's not just a top-down regulatory effort or just a delegation to corporations to deal with it. We need to have an active involvement of citizenship, both in the educational part, but also in the tackling the regulatory part, in trying to understand how we deal with it.
Thank you, Antonella. So tribal media, the need for media literacy, education, as you said, observation and regulation as well. Just for all four of you to ponder and reflect and give me your ideas. I mean, I think in different ways, all four of you have underlined the polarization. We saw that most sort of, let's say, articulated very strongly in the United States elections, but we also see it here in Europe. The challenge of building inclusive societies. I was just wondering, can we really build trust in our democracies at home when we are inevitably so divided in our ideologies, in our political thinking? Economically, there's inequality. How do we rejuvenate this democracy in the 21st century, post-pandemic, where we've seen even more fragilities and weaknesses being illustrated? And if you have questions, please, to all of you who are online, please do start sending them in. And if the Slido is ready, we can show it right after our panelists respond to this challenge I put to them. So Stephan, please.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you raised an important point, about the right now, the seeming inevitability of polarization. But I don't think it is inevitable. And in fact, one of the really remarkable things that I've observed during the last 6 or 7 years is what's happened in the United Kingdom. Because if you look at the data and public opinion about the EU, then as recently as 2012, 2013, no one in the United Kingdom cared about EU membership. It was not mentioned as a top 10 problem by more than like 5 or 8% of the people. And that was consistent for like 10 years. And it's only then, after the whole referendum issue came onto the radar, that all of a sudden it's become this identity-defining issue within the United Kingdom. But it wasn't. And we mustn't forget that. And what's happened, I think, is that there was a massive amount of disinformation and propaganda that was disseminated through, the usual channels, social media, but also mainstream media, that created these divisions. So I don't think that was inevitable. I think that was a consequence of the information landscape. And that brings me to the issue of targeting that was raised, which I think is seriously undermining democracy, because we have a situation now where a machine can learn our personality better than our own spouse from 300 Facebook likes. In other words, advertisers can direct messages to audiences based on their personal vulnerabilities, and they can exploit that. Now, that is something that I think undermines democratic discourse. And that judgment is supported by a number of recent surveys that we have done in Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And what we find in the publics of all three countries is that people do not accept that their personal information is being used for customized political advertising. And remarkably, that is not polarized along partisan lines, even in the United States, which is so rare these days. But what it shows is that there's an opportunity, I think, for regulatory intervention without censoring anybody. This is simply about preventing people's vulnerabilities being targeted online. Now, I don't know if that'll solve everything, but I think it's just yet another tool that we can apply in order to restore a more deliberative information space.
Okay, so you think, Stephan, that is underway in the EU at the moment with all the different initiatives on data sovereignty and autonomy, and do you think this process has begun here at home?
Well, if you're asking me for my subjective judgment, whether I think that process is underway, yes, I hope so. But I can't speak for the European Commission. All I can talk about is what opportunities there are and what the conversation is at the moment. And I think the conversation is pointing in the right direction because, frankly, I don't think we can tolerate what is happening online at the moment for much longer. And I think people on both sides of the Atlantic have discovered that and are willing to act. I hope.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Brigid, now that you're back,
yes, indeed.
Yes.
So, firstly, let me say that I don't think politics in Europe is as polarized as in the United States, number one, and then there's large variation across Europe. That said, and the proportional electoral systems allows for more voice. That said, I would like to address the issue of how we regain trust. And I think here we have to look to what I would call public power. We went through a period where up to the 1970s, the state was interventionist. Then there was a very strong liberalization. We're now back at a time when public power and state capacity will be extremely important in handling the extraordinary economic transitions we're experiencing and also climate change. So we now need state capacity and public power. Also, when it comes to how to make our societies more equal, here I think Europe has always had strong welfare states, but those welfare states have now got to become very adaptable, agile social investment states. In other words, not how you equip a person for one job for life, and if they lose their job, you pay them redundancy. Rather, how you equip people for a rapidly changing world. And here we need to think about the concept of social investment. And we also know from research, this we know, and that is that the more you invest in children, preschool and early school, the more life chances they have. So it's how to direct public policies to most effect to give the best life chances to people. And it really is spend on the young.
Spend on the young, social investments and state capacity. Excuse me. There's a question coming in which says, okay, polarization may not be inevitable, but now that the genie's out of the bottle, how are these divides going to be bridged, especially when they are unavoidable? And the question you mentioned it, Brigid, on issues like climate change. We are divided on that.
So I think one of the characteristics of radical right politics is the politics of you can have it all, or the politics of simple choice. And it's really important that we reintroduce into our public discourse the trade-offs and choices and ways of building consensus. And I think here, anything that helps with deliberation, choice, that helps frame a narrative about the compelling reasons why we've got to do things, I think that really matters. In other words, politicians, but also citizens' assemblies, deliberative forums of one kind or another, all bring us back to the choices and trade-offs that we have to make. In other words, you can't have a universal income, basic income, for example, and low taxation. These are the kinds of debates that we need in order to generate not a level of societal consensus that allows public policy to address all of these issues.
So, there was talk of unethical politicians and Brexit being obviously a kind of outcome of that. Let's say misinformation that people were fed over years, and you're talking about education, but also that debates are nuanced. It's not binary choices. It's not always black and white. And politicians have to be able to explain the subtleties and the nuances. Question also coming up, and I'll move to Mathew, and you can deal with it, Mathew, when I talk to you about also these divides and whether they're inevitable, is also about democracy is not in decline. I mean, it's not expiring. It's not, as Madeleine Albright said, it's not finished. So, and would you say that the US elections have shown that there is now real resilience in the system, and that is something to be inspired by and to admire? Mathew.
Oh, thanks. I guess I'm not quite feeling as optimistic as Secretary Albright, because what I see is, we have looks like a divided government. So the fact that we have separation of powers means that it's a very slow process to get reforms through. And then when you have these parties really at loggerheads, it makes it very hard for the administration to actually operate. So and unfortunately, the paralysis for a lot of Americans, I mean, the paralysis is part of the problem with democracy. That democracy, our institutions are actually dealing with the problems that citizens see. And so, yes, I think it's great that we saw election where more people came out. We have to remember it's more on both sides, but nevertheless came out. And, despite President Trump's claims on fraud and so on, there wasn't that evidence of fraud. I think, just go back to the question on polarization, there are structural issues in the American system. And this goes to Brigid's point that, I think the polarization is much more entrenched. The system favors the extremes in both parties. There are, studies on this, but increasingly in the House of Representatives, there are more and more safe seats. And that's because they basically rejigger every 10 years the electoral districts to favor whoever is in charge of that state, that party. And so you have this as I was starting, this physical and spatial segregation. And you have a large part of the population. In fact, the parties are about 0.25% represented. U.S. electorate, the vast majority are somewhere in the center. And, they actually don't have these necessarily extreme views, or at least what they want is more cooperation. And the parties can get away with not cooperating. I mean, and that, going back to what's going to happen, the Republican
I was going to ask you what's going to happen.
Republican Party is still Trump's party.
Yeah.
It's not clear what role he's going to carve out for himself after he leaves office. But, they led an effort under Obama basically to not cooperate on anything that President Obama wanted to do. And that's I think it's a lot more diabolical. I think the fact that we don't have a tradition of proportional representation, the way it is the case in Europe, makes this a lot more difficult. And also the fact that we have a separations of power, not a parliamentary system, also entrenches that polarization.
And you have a very polarizing personality there, quite an unusual, let's say, circumstances as well. Antonella, from your point of view, what do you think, this polarization, including on issues? There was a question actually from one of the participants online on issues like climate change.
I think, the polarization thing, I think it was said already, it's not an inevitable issue, a challenge. I think that there are clear remedies that we can activate. It's just that they are not simple remedies. It starts and ends with leadership, with the type of political leadership that we need to tackle them. And just as an observation, we see that I think that with the COVID crisis, we have seen an enormous differentiation in the changes in acceptance of the political leaders by countries, and in general, we can say that in many countries there was a strengthening of the connection between leaders and citizenry, and an increasing trust where that has taken place. So it's not, there is, I think that there are somewhere this crisis has created an improvement in trust in government versus a decrease in trust. But there is a big divide. And if we want to understand where were the better performers? What were the key success factors, let me put it this way, of those who were capable of increasing the trust in government? I think that there are, I would say, 7 C's, different C's. I mean, I'm coming from a consulting background in the past before joining public service. So the 7 C's are the ones that for me are a little bit describing what we have been trying here in Austria. First of all, a total orientation to the common cause. Just making clear that the common cause, the commonality is front and center. So that's the first point. The second C is citizen value, making sure that we really think what arrives to the citizen, what arrives to the individuals. And of course, they are very different, but you need to make sure that there is citizen value that is being generated.
You have to go through them faster. Go through them faster, yes.
The third one is acknowledging complexity management. I think it was, Brigid said it before, complexity is a big issue. We have a lot of trade-offs, acknowledging them, not saying there are the simple solutions, making sure that people understand it's complex, it's highly complex. Then clearly the next one is cooperation, and particularly cooperation between science and politics. And we see that the highest support of all leaders is with Jacinda Ardern, and she is also the one that is most viewed as the one that is listening the most to scientists. And then let me finish up with 2 which are more soft topics. Communication, the capability to deliver, to communicate to the people, and the last but not least, compassion, making sure that people understand you really care. Because if you do not, if they don't believe that you care, they don't follow you. So I think this would be my solutions to overcome polarization.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonella. Could we see the results of the Slido poll? If I could ask the organizers to show it, because I'd like to go back to the panel with the results so that they can comment on the results. Okay, so greater tax equity, 49%. Participatory democracy, 43%, laws against misinformation on social media, 39%, more decision-making at regional, local level, 37%, universal basic income is 33%, and public debt down to 2%. So that is a very interesting result, I would say. Let me go back to all 4 of you to comment on this, and to take in a couple of questions that have come in as well. First of all, one question which is absolutely right. I mean, this is the other C, Antonella, the 8th C, complacency. Are we being too complacent in our trust in liberal democracy when we know it's being eroded from within and without? And also there's a question about more powers. Should we be sharing more powers, more funding, I guess, in a sense, also with regions and with cities, because we've seen just how important during COVID-19, but also in the recovery, because we're thinking now of the recovery, the regions and cities are and will be. So let me go back to Brigid, the results of the poll, and also these questions.
Well, the list does not surprise me, because I think tax equity, why is tax equity important? It's important for 2 reasons. One, that taxation essentially allows states to have capacity. If you don't have resources, you don't have capacity. But then you've got to have a tax system whereby the society feels that it is reasonably progressive and fair. When I say reasonably progressive, what do I mean? That those who can pay most. But in fact, I know from a lot of the experiments done on taxation, most people apparently have a kind of a limit on what they consider fair tax. In other words, I think it was around, the state should not take more than 60% of your earned income, regardless of how big that income is. In other words, it's not, states shouldn't take 80%. So I think tax equity is really important. Also, a transparent and effective tax collection system, because it's not just a question of equity, it's a question of the capacity of the state to collect, and that those who evade, basically, there's a price. So I think tax equity. On participatory decisions, I think, again, with all of the digital capacity, I think governments have to be creative and innovative about more consultation, but also participation. But it's not just clicking, it has to be dialogue, because again, I go back to, it's far too easy to ask simple questions and expect simple answers. On cities, I think undoubtedly cities are, most people in the world live in cities today. They are the centres of innovation. They also will be at the forefront in terms of climate, redressing climate, because that's where the big resource changes have to happen, public transport, etc., etc. But we shouldn't forget, as we heard already, the rural parts, because we don't actually want to empty out our countrysides. We want to have reasonably balanced development. On complacency, I don't think any of us can be complacent about democracy. All I can say about democracy is it is fragile. It is a constant, it requires constant vigilance and effort. But it does make an enormous difference to one's life if one lives in a democracy or not. And therefore, the prize is very precious. And when I hear sophologists talk about voting as low cost, low benefit, these are my fellow political scientists, it really makes my blood boil, because I think of all those parts of the world where if one had the opportunity to vote, one would be so appreciative of that right. So again, complacency, no. A constant vigilance, yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Brigid. So let's move to Stephan. Stephan, was there something in that Slido poll that surprised you, or does it reconfirm your own thinking?
Okay, I wasn't surprised, but I would have ordered them differently. Let me first underscore my agreement with Brigid that, tax equity is essential. In fact, there's data to suggest that greater inequality provides a greater opportunity for populists that often translates into a greater vote share. So in part, this populist wave that we have seen may have resulted from inequity. So I totally agree that is something that needs to be fixed. On the participatory angle, I also want to emphasize that and draw attention to an example you're probably all familiar with, which is the Republic of Ireland, which has resolved two extremely emotive and potentially polarizing issues, namely abortion and gay marriage, without polarization, or at least with a manageable degree of polarization. And I think in large part that was due to the citizens' assemblies that they had. Now, there's a lot of research to suggest that if you put people into a space where they can deliberate with a skilled moderator and with expert advice, they can come up with amazingly creative solutions, because they're isolated from the clickbait and the demagogues and the tabloids and all these other influences that we have in the sort of day-to-day life. So I think absolutely deliberative assemblies or deliberative aspects of democracy are crucial. And indeed, in our report, we have a whole chapter on how this can be done online, and there are precedents for this around the world that I find very encouraging. Now, the final thing I want to mention is the one thing that I disagree with is to have laws against disinformation on social media, which was the third highest ranked policy option. I find that very difficult, because there is a slippery slope there to censorship. And as much as I have been opposing demagoguery and misinformation and everything for the last 10 or 20 years of my career, I'm always very concerned about governments deciding, a Ministry of Truth deciding what should be on social media and what shouldn't be. So I don't think we want to do exactly that. I think what we need to do is to have laws and regulations that make the information architecture conducive to high quality information rather than low quality information. And if we combine that with more equitable tax distribution and looking after citizens, the 7 C's, which I love, then I think this misinformation problem will honestly resolve itself, because it is no longer attractive for politicians to lie to people if they're not being believed. And we have to create that situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So thank you very much. Mathew, anything in that poll that surprised you? Anything that alarmed you?
I would have put give more responsibility to regional local bodies much higher. At least in the US, if you look at the public surveys, the public actually has a confidence in the regional local institutions. And that's where you don't have the polarization in most cases that you see at the federal level. And we haven't talked much about this in this panel, but we're living through this COVID moment, and for at least in the US, for lots of states and cities, this is almost a life or death struggle. Because the economy, and obviously, nobody is going to work anymore in the cities. The economy in the cities are just falling through the floor. They don't know, nobody can pay rents. So you're having I think a real issue. It goes back to Brigid's point about capacity. If we have people collect taxes, but if people can't pay taxes, your cities can't really function, including some of the basic functions like education. So this is, I think, they have to be provided with the means to get through this particular critical point. But, increasingly, I think we can resolve some of the problems at the regional, local level, and get away maybe from the constant battles in Washington.
Mm-hmm. And as Brigid pointed out on climate change as well, I mean, cities have such a huge role to play. And in the United States, I mean, despite Donald Trump's opposition, cities and states have gone ahead. So very, very valid points. Antonella, can I turn to you? And actually, it's an interesting question that's come in as well. And I know that perhaps in other meetings here in ESPAS, they've talked about the Conference on the Future of Europe, but that was supposed to be the big moment, wasn't it, where we would discuss democracy and how to reinforce European democracy. And somehow it hasn't really, let's say, maybe COVID did it, maybe lack of interest did it, but we're not really talking about the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I have to say, as Stephan said, in today's online world, I mean, that kind of forum could have been organized and perhaps should be organized. So, Antonella, screen's yours.
I think it's fantastic that you mentioned the conference about the future of Europe, because I do think, and it is in line with some of the responses, and as the others have said before me, I'm not surprised overall, but a little bit sort of the prioritization is a little bit, I would put it in a slightly different way, but I think that there are two elements that come across that are really linked also to this conference on the future of Europe, which is the participatory decisions and making sure that there is somehow more decentralization, more local and regional level playing a role. And I think that if we really want to use this COVID moment, perhaps also the COVID delay that we have now on the conference on the future of Europe in the right way, we should utilize that to have a real broad engagement, really in all countries in Europe, making sure that we have the citizens express. Everybody has an opinion about Europe. They should express their opinion about Europe. What is the value that they expect from Europe, and what do they not expect from Europe? I think that this issue about citizen value and value delivery is essential, and how to make sure that we have the right combination of what is going on the local and regional level versus what is going on the, I would say, the enormously important framing level that Europe is doing, and I think, we should have an engagement also at that level. What type of frame do we want to live in? The frame is really the values, and I'm super happy about what Brigid said about the fact that we all seem to have a shared concept of democracy in Europe, and from the values we seem to share it, but we have differences in performance, in delivery, and differences in how we implement it. And so we need to have an involvement of the citizens to make sure that this frame, if there is a common frame, is reinforced, is made transparent, is made explicit and not just implicit. And then within this frame that we think how to work in it and to bring it to the local level. And I think this is the big leadership challenge that we have to manage, what is going on the ground, and at the same time manage, this frame setting and also some of the regulatory frame setting that needs to happen.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. We have 4 minutes left to finish. I'm sorry I won't be able to take any more questions, but there were some very interesting questions. But I do want each of our panelists in, say, 40 seconds to give me your one main, I love doing that. All moderators love doing that. If I was a panelist, I would probably hate it. But very quickly, your main takeaway and your hope for this wonderful thing we call democracy. Brigid.
Can I use my 40 seconds to say something about the Irish Citizens' Assemblies? Because it wasn't just the Citizens' Assemblies, but it was also that the output of those assemblies were brought back into the Parliament and deliberated on by a parliamentary committee. And it's extremely important not to juxtapose representative democracy with participatory democracy. We need both.
Okay, that was very good. So, Stephan?
Well, I think very briefly, we do have the tools and the knowledge available to bring democratic accountability to the online information space. We can do that without censorship, and we can do that to protect democracy. And I think we have to move forward on that urgently.
Thank you very much. Mathew?
Well, as one of our politicians has said, crises are a terrible thing to waste. And we're in another watershed moment. We can actually help to reestablish trust in democracy if we have an equitable, inclusive recovery from this COVID crisis, instead of what happened in 2008.
Thank you. Antonella?
Yeah, I think that we need to reflect beyond what has been said by all the others, and I think making sure that we do not become complacent about this enormous gift of democracy that we have. I think that we need also to utilize technology not just as something that is creating us some problems, but as part of the solution in supporting both representative and participatory democracy, and also in fighting misinformation and disinformation actively. So I think let us think how we can, through innovation, through technology, also support this enormous gift that we have and protect democracy.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to the four panelists. So the question we were asked was, what is the future? How is the future of democracy? And I think all of four of you have responded, and I would agree with you that the future is fairly good, but it needs constant vigilance, constant tender loving care, and good politicians and good policies to lead the way. Thank you very much indeed. And I think the conversation was very, very good. Thank you for that. And back to the studio. Bye.